far too long, I lived life in my way, in my strength, by myself. But the mountains kept getting higher, the way was rocky, each step was more difficult than the last. But now I see a different way, a better way, with God and His people. I'm reminded of a song that says, "In the highlands and the heartache, you're neither more or less inclined. I would search and stop at nothing. You're just not that hard to find." So now, here on this mountain, I can see clearly that I was never really alone.
Well, good morning, Emmanuel Faith. How are you today? My name is Scott Smith. You know, the earlier service, I just started speaking, and they looked at me like, who are you? It's been a little too long, perhaps. But happy Independence Day to you. Happy birthday to America. You know, I was thinking, while I was thinking that while our founding fathers were not perfect men, one of the things that they did get right was their desire to protect the religious freedoms of those who lived in America at that time and who would continue to live and even be living today. And so for the past 245 years, people like us in places like this have gathered to worship. Nobody telling us what songs we got to sing, what passages we got to speak, what we can say. Don't have to turn in my manuscript to somebody to oversee it and make sure that it hits with whatever the state wants it to say. I think we can all agree we're very grateful for the way that the framers were led and the way that they followed. And it's more than interesting to me as we make our way through these Psalms of Ascent that we come this morning to Psalm 122, which talks about corporate worship. Only God could have done that. So as we continue our series entitled Road Trip Playlist, I want to invite you to turn to Psalm 122. We're going to be looking this morning at biblical wisdom for how we can continue to nurture our passion for corporate worship. If you'd like to follow along, there should be a Bible in that seat back in front of you. Page 612 will take you to our text. So Psalm 122 is the third of 15 songs of ascent. If you haven't been with us the past couple of weeks, these songs of ascent are made up of Psalms 120 to 134. And they were the songs that the people of God sang as they went up to Jerusalem to the feasts that God instructed them to attend. So in the spring, they went for the feast of Passover. In the summer, early summer, they went for Pentecost. And in autumn, they went for the Feast of Tabernacles. And so 3 times a year, they made their journey from wherever they lived to Jerusalem. And as they went, these were the songs that they sang. These were what was dialed into their road trip playlist. And as we study this psalm this morning, we're going to find that David can hardly wait. He can hardly wait to be in the presence of God with the people of God. This psalm is not about nurturing your private passion for worship. It's about nurturing our corporate passion for worship. David wants to go and worship the Lord. And we're going to find that his prospect, it fuels his jubilance as he makes his way to Jerusalem. We're also going to find that he has left us with a strategy for joining him in his joy. There are reasons we're going to discover why he felt the way that he felt. There are things which he did, which kept his passion for corporate worship, worshiping God in the presence of God and with the people of God, keeping that fresh and current. And I think his desire was that as these ancient pilgrims would make their way to Jerusalem, that they would sing these songs as a way of stoking that fire. And I think that if he were here today, that would be his hope for us as well. Now, if you look at your note sheet, or if you look up here, you'll see that I put a question mark after my title. Oh, happy day? Oh, happy day! Exclamation point. But I see in this psalm that this question mark is the main tension. because I know from personal experience that not everyone is glad when they are presented with the opportunity to go to the house of the Lord. I remember as a kid that I would get excited on Sunday mornings when I thought that my parents had slept in so late that we weren't going to have to go to church. We lived about 25 minutes from our church. And our family would go together to the 8 o'clock service and then Sunday school at 9:45. And so I'm a 9-year-old and I got to get up at 6:30 on a Sunday. And so I'm looking at my clock, it's 6:30, 6:35, 6:40. I'm thinking, we're not going today. And I wasn't so happy when my parents came in and said, Scott, get up. It's time to go to the house of the Lord. And even as adults, this happens to us, doesn't it? Don't look at me like it doesn't happen to you. It happens to me as well. But I'll tell you what, if we don't always look forward maybe to coming to corporate worship, I wanted you to think a little bit about what it might have been like for somebody living in biblical times. I did a little bit of research here. Some of the people going up to Jerusalem could have been looking at a 4 to 6 day journey. 4 to 6 days. And then when they get there, the feast lasts anywhere from 1 to 2 weeks. And then they got a 4 to 6 day journey back. They could be looking at being gone from home 3 to 4 weeks. Now here's an interesting thing. Nazareth is 90 miles from Jerusalem. And Luke chapter 2 tells us that Jesus and his family would go up to Jerusalem for the feast of Passover every year. So I started thinking, okay, what cities and towns near to Escondido are about 90 miles away? And I landed on Long Beach. Long Beach, California is about 90 miles away. So could you imagine going to Long Beach once a year, but you had to walk? Or take a horse or a donkey or something like this? I was talking to my buddy who's getting ready to go to Yosemite, and he's trying to figure out, okay, I got to take this car, and I'm probably going to have to rent that trailer, and I got to make all these provisions. And I said, dude, could you imagine? This is just for him and his wife and his 2 kids. I said, dude, could you imagine if you had to take your in-laws and your parents? David lived to be 70, so assume that the average Hebrew lived to be 70. Could you imagine making a 90-mile trip 40 or 50 or 60 times in your life? And could you imagine that maybe, just maybe on one of those you weren't totally looking forward to it? So what could they do? What could they do as they made that trip? I'll tell you what they could do. They could sing Psalm 122. And you know what we can do when we find our passion for corporate worship maybe flagging a little bit, waning a little bit? We can also sing Psalm 122. So let's dig into a little bit, see what it has to say. This is verse 1. I was glad, David said, when they said to me, let's go to the house of the Lord. What we see here is that David he's inviting them, he's calling them to sing about expectation. He's calling us to be people of expectation. David thinks about going and he's filled with joy as he prepares. He works through his packing list. He checks his supplies. He checks his provisions. And he's filled with gladness. But it's not just a generic gladness. It's a specific gladness. It's a gladness that is driven by his desire to be in the sanctuary in Jerusalem. In the Hebrew, the house of the Lord comes before the verb. So it's house of the Lord, let us go to. And the idea is it's putting emphasis on the house of the Lord. This is where David wants to go, make no mistake. But as we read the rest of the psalm, this is where it gets interesting to me. We quickly see his focus shift. It shifts from, I was glad when they said, let's go, to how he feels when he gets there. He writes one verse in the past tense and the rest of the psalm in the present. He writes one verse about going to corporate worship, and the rest of it is about the city of Jerusalem. And I found that very interesting. That's not what I would have expected him to do. So what's he up to? I think what he's doing is, as they are making their way on this journey, he's creating space for them to remember what it felt like the first time that they went into the city. And I think that he's onto something here, and I think what he's telling us is that one way that we can grow our expectation is by being people who remember. One way we can grow our expectation is being people who remember. As a kid, I had the privilege, of course, of participating in corporate worship every week at the number of different churches that we attended over the years. But I also had the privilege of participating in corporate worship of the Los Angeles Rams. Because you see, my dad had season tickets, and he was very generous to me, and he would bring me along. First to games at the Coliseum, and then to Anaheim Stadium. And then in the off season, when there was no football, what did I do to kind of stoke that passion and look forward to going back in the fall? I remembered what it was like to go to those games with my dad. And I think that the principle here is that remembering has a way of keeping things fresh. Remembering has a way of keeping things fresh. So then the question that becomes, well, what does David remember? And what does David want these pilgrims to remember? And what does David want us to remember? And what can we learn? Well, let's go back to the text, verse 2. He says this: "Our feet have been standing within your gates, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, built as a city that is bound firmly together." The first thing we see is that David calls them to remember the place that they worship. He calls us to remember the place that we worship. I don't think it takes much to figure out here what David is doing. One commentator imagines him walking into the city for the first time and just standing there and marveling at it. The way that it's built, constructed, the government buildings, the homes of the residents, the massive walls. Think about the first time you took your kid or your grandkid to Disneyland. It's that. It's that. And I can completely understand this power of a memory. Because I remember getting to the stadium early with my dad because he wanted to park off. He didn't want to park inside the stadium because he didn't want to pay to park. Love that man. And we would walk from what is now where the Mighty Ducks play over there in that area. We would walk up to our seats. Our seats were actually over here. But we would walk up. Then we would walk down the tunnel to our seats. And I could see the players on the field. I could hear the band. I could see the cheerleaders. I could smell hot dogs and other things. And as I got there and I nestled into my seat, the power of remembering. And then there is this campus. This place is our Jerusalem, so to speak. And so when you think of this place, what do you think of? I wrote some things down. I think of coming on campus early. This is me. This is my experience. I think of coming on campus early on a Sunday morning, about 45 minutes to an hour. In fact, I did this morning before the first service starts. I park in the south lot in the spot that Dennis Keating used to park in, but he vacated it. I've taken it. It's mine. I'm not there this morning, but I will be there next week. Some of you know exactly what spot I'm talking about. It's a choice spot. You can't have it. Okay. I walk up, I see the block letters on the side of this building that say Worship Center. It's early, so there's still dew on the grass. But what I see are footprints on the grass from the choir and orchestra members who are too rebellious to use the sidewalk in order to come in through the back entrance, right? And then I come in, and I came in this morning, there was already people here. There's already people here. And they're reading their worship folder. Or maybe they've opened up the Bible to the passage that we're going to be looking at that particular morning. Some are catching up on the week that was. The orchestra this morning when I got here was on stage, full choir and orchestra, and they're warming up. They're doing their thing. Margie Oliver, who plays the organ, is over there trying to bring that thing out of hibernation. Sometimes I walk up in front and I just imagine what I get to see now, which is God's people joining in worship to thank the one who has been so faithful to them the past 7 days. And just thinking about that midweek made me want to come here. Made me want to come and worship. For many, this is the place, this building, this campus, this space is the place where God met them and saved them. It's where they got baptized. It's where they grew in their faith. Might be where they met their spouse, dedicated their kids, experienced freedom from an addiction, learned to study the Bible, and the list goes on and on and on. I think what David is telling us is remember all of the good things that have happened here at 639 East 17th Avenue. And let those memories fuel your desire to come here and be with the people of God, worshiping Him. Let that memory do what it's supposed to do. There is power in remembering place. But there's also power in remembering people. Look at what he writes in verse 4. To which the tribes go up, the tribes of the Lord. There the thrones for judgment were set, the thrones of the house of David. If you're familiar with the history of the Jewish people, you'll know that there were 12 tribes, and I won't ask you to tell me what they are because I can't tell you what they are, but there were 12 of them. And this was how the nation was broken down into subgroups. And David mentions that there are families and people who are going into the city to worship for the feasts. And I can imagine that friendships and lifelong bonds are created by among these people as they see each other year in and year out. While lifelong bonds were not created at those Rams games, friendships most certainly were. When you see the same people 5, 8, 10 Sundays a year for 5, 10, 15 years, you can't help but get to know each other better, at least a little bit. So I'm going to ask you this. What do you think of when you think of the people of Emmanuel Faith? Again, I wrote some stuff down. I don't want to single anybody out. It's not about that. But I think of guys like Greg Brosey and Monty Bowers, Julia Feth, others, everyone, too numerous to count, Mike Mutoni, Don Smith, who's always so friendly to my parents, who faithfully and graciously stand at those back doors and those side doors and out on the walkways and welcome you in and say, we are glad you're here. Come on in. Let's worship together. Let's see what God has for us. I think of the friendships formed by the people who sit in the same general area week in and week out, month in and month out, year in and year out. Some of those friendships run deep, don't they? They run deep. And significant and meaningful and reciprocity type of relationships in ministry happen. I think of the adult fellowships, some of whom started as young marrieds classes 50 years ago. And they're meeting this morning in this hour. And they have prayed their kids through stuff. And they have prayed their grandkids through stuff. And now they're praying their great-grandkids through stuff. And when one of them gets sick, they rally the troops and they provide what's needed. When one ends up in the hospital, they go and they visit. When one of their spouses dies, they go and they cry with them. I think of the cafe. Glad it's opening next week. I've developed some very meaningful relationships with people just sitting out there and talking, having a chocolate donut and a cup of tea. But stuff happens. 2 more, 3 more. I think of this ragtag group of saints. I'm looking at you, Fishbeck, who sit out there, Cochrane, in the courtyard every Sunday until 2 or 3 in the afternoon. And I think, good Lord, why won't they go home? I think of our 75th anniversary. We sat out under that tent, and we were challenged to keep on keeping on. I remember our corporate business meeting in here when we voted to bring on Ryan Paulson. But mostly what I think about when I think about the people of Emmanuel Faith is you. I think of you. And what a joy and a privilege it is to come here every week and worship and grow and struggle and celebrate, laugh, cry, be in life groups together, work together. I think of you. I think of you. I think David looked forward to seeing the people of God when he went to Jerusalem. And he wanted everyone to feel the same way. You know, there's something powerful about worshiping with people that you can see and touch and hear sing off-key. If COVID taught us nothing else, it taught us that. When we came back, one of the first things that my wife said was that being here and worshiping in person with other believers, it brought new life to her soul. Raise your hand if you felt the same way. We did. Yeah, remembering the people with whom we worship is something that God will use to nurture our passion for corporate worship. But then there are times, being honest, when we remember place and we remember people, and it's still not kind of getting us to where we might want to be, to where God would want us to be. So what happens then? Verse 4. Sometimes you just got to remember the precept to worship, as was decreed for Israel, to give thanks to the name of the Lord. David says, you know what? Sometimes you just got to remember to go and worship. You just got to make that decision to be obedient. You might say, and I can hear you, Scott, it'd be dishonest for me to come to church and praise God when I'm not feeling like it. I would be a hypocrite. How do you think David would respond to that? I think with a smile on his face, he'd put his arm around you and he'd say, I don't care how you feel. It's a command. We know that we worship as believers because we want to. But we also know that we do not worship only because we feel like it. There's a difference between wanting to and feeling like. Feelings are great liars. Chip Whitman used to say, feelings and emotions are like the city bus. If you wait 20 minutes, another one will be along. Feelings are important in many ways, but in matters of faith, they are completely unreliable. One of the guys I read this week in my study, he said, have you ever noticed how when it comes to the commands of God, that God wastes very little time on the way we feel? I've been thinking about that. And yet we have Psalm 122, which is about kind of trying to get us into the feeling of it. So it's not that he spends no time on it. He just doesn't spend a lot. And why would that be? Because God knows a thing or two about a thing or two, right? He knows this. He knows what we often forget. We are shaped more by our practices than we are by our passions. We are shaped more by our practices than we are by our passions. You know, we live in this age of sensation. And we think that if we're not feeling it, then there's no authenticity that can be derived from doing it. This quote from Eugene Peterson is money in the bank, because the wisdom of God says something different. The wisdom of God says that we can act ourselves into a new way of feeling much quicker than we can feel ourselves into a new way of acting. And this was an interesting thought. He goes on to point out in this book, Along Obedience in the Same Direction, that worship is an act that develops feelings for God, not a feeling for God that is expressed in an act of worship. And when we obey the command to come and worship corporately, we actually nurture our passion for corporate worship. It's amazing how that works. Of course, we know there are health limitations that prevent people from coming. I know there are tons of people who are watching online right now who would love to be here but can't. This admonition is not for you. But the reality is the majority of us, when we decide not to come to church, it's not because of health, right? It's not because of health. But let me ask you this. Have you ever felt like not coming to church, but decided to anyway, and at the end of the service you were like, well, that was just a waste of my time? No, it doesn't happen that way for you, and it doesn't happen that way for me. I think I don't really want to come. I work here. I can come here for work and still not come into a worship service. Don't tell anyone. And sometimes I'm like, I don't really want to go. I come. And at the end of the service, I'm like, I'm such a knucklehead. That was amazing. What was I thinking? What was I thinking? David's advice to us when our heart isn't in it, engage your will. Lead your heart. Don't follow it. And use your brain to remember. The last time you thought this, you went anyway, and how good it was, jump there. So all of this relates to how we can be people of expectation by remembering. There's two other things that I want to get to as we wrap up the psalm. And it's this. In addition to being people of expectation, we can be people of prayer. Prayer for this church and the church. Look at what he says. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. May they be secure who love you. Peace be within your walls and security within your towers. For my brothers and companions' sake, I will say, peace be within you. For the sake of the house of the Lord our God, I will seek your good. Jerusalem was to Israel what the church is for us as Christians. So David praying for Jerusalem is like us praying for Emmanuel faith. And you know by teaching and by experience that our hearts soften towards the things that we pray about. Right? that our hearts begin to long for the things that we pray about. And I think one of the reasons that David is so excited to go to Jerusalem and involve himself in corporate worship is because he's been praying for Jerusalem. Probably during the whole year. Many of you I know pray for this church. And if you're not one of them, I'd love to encourage you to start. And especially as maybe you're looking at your desire for corporate worship and you're thinking, I'm just sensing it's not maybe where it should or could be. What could I do about that? Begin to pray for Emmanuel faith. And you might wonder, well, what do I pray for? Well, a lot of people think that the rest of these verses was David telling them, here's what you could pray for. Pray that those who love Emmanuel faith would be secure. Pray that there would be peace here. We'll talk in a second, but we would be a people of peace. Goodness, that we would be secure, that God would keep us safe when we worship here. Pray for the good of this. Pray for the sake of the house of the Lord. Pray for our good. I'm telling you, if you could measure your passion for corporate worship before you start praying for this church, and as you continue to pray, you're going to watch it go up and get hotter and hotter and hotter, because that's the way that God has set it up. He guarantees it. Be people of expectation. Be people of prayer. Lastly, be people of peace. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Verse 7, peace be within your walls. Verse, I think it's 9, peace be within you. So here's the thing, right? We look at all these people are converging on Jerusalem. Tribes, different parts of the land, different ways of doing things, different ways of thinking about things. And how do you have peace within the walls of Jerusalem? The only way is if the people who are going in are people of peace. That's the way that works. Let me illustrate this. This week, my wife, Derica, people always think I say Derek, Derica, and her BFF, Ella, went to Knott's Berry Farm Tuesday. It was the second day that Knott's had reopened since COVID, and it was packed. And I asked Derica, I said, well, how was it? She said, it was awesome. I said, how come? She said, because everyone was so nice. Everyone was friendly, kind, patient, peaceful. I said, would you like to go back? She said, absolutely. And the same is true for corporate worship here, Emmanuel Faith. When we're people of peace, when we defer to one another, when we give each other the benefit of the doubt, when we seek to serve each other, when we lay aside our preferences, when we walk in and we see someone sitting in our seat and they didn't know it was our seat, we just find another seat. I know people who were kicked out of their seats down here and went to the balcony. That's not being a person of peace. It's just a chair. If you'd like to buy a seat license from me, I'll sell you one. But when we lay aside our preferences, it makes the other person's experience of corporate worship mo better. And my peace, me being a person of peace, doesn't nurture my passion for corporate worship. It nurtures yours. And you being a person of peace doesn't nurture your passion for corporate worship. It nurtures mine. And that's the way that God has set it up. I need you, and you need me. It's not just my passion. It's not just your passion. It's our passion. That's why it's called corporate worship. How appropriate this morning that we come to the table, an opportunity to just say, what do I need to do to take that question mark and turn it into an exclamation point? Now, maybe it already is an exclamation point. God bless it if it is. I don't want to assume it's not. But the challenge is this: will we be a people who let God's word and his Spirit have his way in us, that our passion for corporate worship might continue to be nurtured?